And Randy is from Naamat, and I was supposed to introduce Randy after I introduced myself and the organizations that I work with. But, I think that just for the sake of time, we're going to just jump into this. And I'll introduce you, although I don't really have anything written about you. So I'll just say in my introduction to you is, from what I understand, you have been doing unbelievable work in the world of psychology, mental health, anxiety. You're one of the creators and leaders of PTSD and CBT. And it just so happens that I have one sister who lives in Kfar Saba, Israel, and you are her mentor. And I've been hearing about, Danny for so long, and it was so great to connect with you directly. And I'm so happy that we have an opportunity to see you. So, Shalom, Randy, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry for the mix-up. This session is recorded, by the way. And I actually started introducing to just jump into the conversation. So I think that I introduced a little bit myself, the organizations that I work with, started to introduce Danny. You will continue, Randy, but just a little bio about Randy. Who is Randy? So Randy is Randy Sable. She worked as a speech language pathologist for over 40 years in the Philadelphia area, but she's very, very involved with Naamat USA. Specifically, now she's the co-president of the local Naamat USA chapter, Rimonim Philly, and has served on the national board is, in the leader last 3 years as advocacy chair. And she does a lot of different things in the organization. She really values sincerely the values of Naamat, the largest women's organization in Israel. She and her husband, Don, they split their time between United States, here in Philadelphia area, and Hod Sharon with her children and grandchildren. So Randy, welcome. Thank you again for joining us and for hosting. And now you can formally introduce Danny a little bit. I started talking a little bit about him, and now I admire what he does and my sister, and we'll jump right into it. And everybody, just sorry again for the delay. This session will be between 60 minutes until 75 minutes. Likely we'll finish in about 12:15 Eastern time. Feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section below.
Okay, first of all, Chodesh Tov, and I want to thank Yair for helping to organize this, along with Ivy Mermelstein, Sarah Musher-Brenner, who is helping the Naamat people get on, and Yvonne Mascara Rodriguez. Real quick about Naamat, because I would be remiss in not doing this. For 100 years, Naamat has been at the forefront of helping women, children, and families in Israel. We do critical work with women's health, with rights centers, with the domestic violence center, shelter. They have 153 daycare centers throughout Israel servicing 12,000 children. And there are 2 youth villages. There are 13 technological high schools. There's scholarship funds, and there is also a legal aid bureau. Now, let me say a few words about Dr. Danny Derby. And Danny, it's okay to call you Danny, I think. Okay, good. So Dr. Derby is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in trauma-related disorders, and he is founder and clinical director of Cognetica. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Cognetica, but it's close enough.
Cognetica, a leading center for cognitive behavioral therapy in Israel. He has extensive experience in PTSD and anxiety disorders. He is co-author of a newer book, New Horizons, Cognitive Processing Therapy for PTSD and Related Disorders. He co-authored with Professor Patricia Resick. And since October 7th, he's been leading a national project to train therapists in cognitive processing therapy for PTSD in collaboration with Professor Jonathan Huppert from Hebrew U, and also with the Israeli Ministry of Health. To date, they have trained over 550 therapists, and they have 50 supervision groups throughout the country, servicing Israel's health system and the military. Dr. Derby, welcome.
Thank you.
Baruch haba. I think our first question for you is, how are you? Yair and I were speaking about this, and the first thing was, well, let's see how he is. Take his temperature. How
In,
are you since October
in
7th?
Israel, it's a question that asking it, the answer is complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah,
You know, if you take into account both the political and war situation here. So
right.
complicated is a good answer, I would say.
Well, lead in. Go ahead. I mean, how are you? So professionally, explain to us what's been going on for you.
Okay, so it's since you mentioned our work, and it's quite an amazing story. I think I was approached uh, around 3 years ago by Professor Patty Resick, whom I trained with, and I did some of my training with her 25 years ago. And she approached me and she said that she has somebody who wants to donate money to develop services in Israel for PTSD. And my thought was, we should look for something that would be sustainable, and that we will be able to have services available for the larger number of people, and that the project would stay after the money is over. Usually a lot of times you have a donation, you do something with it, and it goes away. And I was a part of this project already that Jonathan Huppert from Hebrew University initiated, and it was training therapists within the mental health system in Israel. And I said it's a good idea to connect this, this donation with the project. And we actually started working on developing the project with the Ministry of Health and try to get the military on board. And surprisingly, it was very difficult to get the military on board. We actually didn't succeed at that time. And we had the Ministry of Health, and we were trying to have the project running, and hit a lot of difficulties building the project within the system. And we actually were supposed to launch at the end of October 23. And but meanwhile, as we were supposed to launch, we actually trained supervisors within the project, so we can train people and have them supervised. So we had, and then October 7th hit us, and with all its terrible consequences, and we actually started the project. We launched on a week earlier than we planned, and started training therapists. I must say, in terms of the idea of the project was actually to train supervisors, and then to train therapists, and then to have them supervised. And we managed in a relatively, I would say, short period of time to train, you mentioned 550 therapists. By the end of next Friday, it would be 660 therapists that we have trained, and the majority of them are receiving supervision, which is an important part of training to assure the quality of the services. And we are able to do that within both the Ministry of Health, the HMOs in Israel, and the military, which there's a very large need for these services, especially in the military. And by the way, the military actually got on board as we started. So initially they were not on board, and then they joined us, and now they're an important part of this project. And we have many supervision groups and people who have been trained within the military. So, the project is running, we're training, and we're treating a lot of people. As you can imagine, the number of people trained, we are actually reaching out to a lot of places in a lot of areas. The services are available all over the country, which is something that is really, really important. So you can get, therapy for trauma in Tiberias, and in Rahat, and in Beersheba, and in Eilat. So this is really the big thing about the project, that it's accessible throughout the country.
So because you already had the project in place, it sort of smoothed the transition post October 7th. You didn't have to go scrambling because you had already started this project.
We were actually supposed to train 100 therapists, and we ended up training 660. But yeah, it made it much easier. And you know, the amazing thing about this project is that the supervisors committed to doing a lot of supervision groups, because and you know, you need people who are committed, who are able to take, you know, to get this time free so they can have the groups running. And you know, this project is actually continuing, and you know, we are continuing to train people. So we train people to treat PTSD, and now we're going to train people to treat complicated grief. So there are other aspects to the project that we're continuing to do within the public health system.
For the listeners, I don't know that people have an idea of how long a process it is to treat people for PTSD. And then you mentioned I'm sorry, the grief people who are, I'm sorry, the expression you used was
Complicated grief.
complicated grief. Okay, maybe answer my first question and then explain what complicated grief is, please.
So, you know, it's surprising because a lot of times when people talk, especially in the media, when you hear about traumatic events, you think about people who will never recover, or that, you know, they're doomed, or, you know, this is something so terrible that happened. And it's true for both, you know, if you talk about war zone victims, but also rape victims, a lot of times you hear that.
Right.
And you know, luckily it's not true. You know, and luckily, when you think about trauma, the majority of people who go through trauma would actually heal without treatment. And you know, when we're thinking about it, only a small percentage of people would actually need therapy after going through trauma. So that's one thing that people don't know and is really important. And the other thing is, when you consider other disorders, you know, and other mental health conditions, we really know how to treat PTSD well. So comparing to other disorders that people might have that, you know, might seem simple, you know. So you can have social phobia, or you can have OCD, and it's not that there are no treatments for these disorders, but we really know well to treat PTSD. And if you look at the cognitive processing therapy, is one of the therapies that we trained people in, and another one is WET, which is written exposure therapy. So if you look at these treatments, these are short-term treatments. So the majority of people will finish treatment within 12 sessions. So 12 weeks is, and actually you can do the treatment in less than 12 weeks. You can do it in 8 days.
Wow.
So there are a lot of studies for this treatment, and also of intensive treatment. And you know, we see now, you know, we see people. I work a lot with the military now, so we see a lot of soldiers, and they come to therapy with, you know, terrible events that they went through, and when you see them initially, they have like a mountain of symptoms. And you know, a lot of them would recover in a 12 weeks period, which is, I personally find it quite amazing. And you know, when people talk to me about it, you know, I say I actually have a cut, as you can see on my hand. And if you saw it a week ago, it looked really bad. And it's the same thing. You know, we really have a good ability to heal. And sometimes we might get stuck in the way. And if we get stuck in the way, all you need is to initiate this process. And once you initiate it, it will continue. So this is something that, you know, we really have to keep in mind. This is not, you know, these people are not doomed. And even the people who went through the most severe traumas, you know, just like 2 weeks ago, I started supervising on a case, and really the description of the event and the description of the symptoms that this guy had were so severe. And you know, the therapist comes 2 weeks later and he said, you know, it's amazing. We talked about it in supervision, and it's really helped. He came back and he was different. And a lot of time we see this difference. So, you know, when you target the disorder and you target what's blocking recovery, you know, it's really reinitiate the process, and then people heal.
So, question is the traits that the majority of people who don't need PTSD therapy, would you say those traits are resolve or resilience? What are those traits that help people, the majority of people, get past it? And can you teach those traits to the 20% that need PTSD?
You know, it's quite interesting, because if you look at the studies, there's no real good explanation to why people get stuck. And is it personality? It's a good question. I personally don't think so. I think that sometimes you're using you're trying to solve a problem with the wrong tool. And so, you know, we know that people who have PTSD initially have more severe symptoms. So, and they use, once they have the symptoms, they prefer to avoid the symptoms. So, you know, what they do is they try to avoid it. Once they try to avoid it, avoidance is one of the maintaining factors. So, you know, if they stop meeting their friends and they stop going out and they, you know, they don't meet their family, and, you know, so this is one of the major things that all treatments that work actually target avoidance. It's one of the things that the treatments target. And you know, once people get back to life, get back to this course of not avoiding, and also in PTSD, it's very important to say, people try to avoid the memory, not only, you know, people or events or reminders outside the person. People are trying to avoid the memory of the event. And this is, you know, we are trying to teach people to do the opposite. Once you have these thoughts come up, you know, allow yourself to experience the emotions that are associated with the memory. And usually once you allow yourself to feel these natural emotions, you know, you are on a good path.
Danny, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and ask you more of a general questions.
Sure.
There's going to be questions in the Q&A, and we're going to merge and combine some of these questions throughout this conversation. So my question, and I'm combining it with Nina's question, is this. I live in the United States. We live in the United States, and we see that the last year and a half has been, I don't know if the right word is traumatic, but very difficult and causing so much anxiety to so many. We see it on the WhatsApp groups of the Jewish people because of the hostages, because of the Iran, you know, the missiles and everything. It's very, very, the anti-Semitism in the United States. But we can only imagine how hard it is to be in Israel, because, and we're not talking about the soldiers necessarily who have been in the war zone and seen horrible things. I'm talking about the regular people who have been blasted by the news nonstop, 24/7, and there's missiles falling on their heads, and they see the horrible images of the videos, the terrible videos of the families that lost so many people and the hostages. So I think that Nina's question is a very good one. Since October 7th, how do you estimate in Israel, like put on the side for a second the soldiers and all those people, but just the regular population who lives in the north, in the south, in Tel Aviv, how do you estimate, and do you need to treat their anxiety disorders or PTSD?
You know, first of all, we can say, you know, our project is a PTSD project, but one of the things that we saw when we started running with our project is you have to address anxiety and you have to address depression, because there's an increase in both anxiety and depression, you know, in the general public, because you're exposed, you know, and I think without getting into politics, we got into this October 7th when we had a severe conflict in the country, and you know, people had on both sides of the political spectrum, people had you know, clashes between one another, and then came this terrible event, and you know, we had to in a way metabolize all these the what happened, you know, politically, and what happened with the October 7th and the war. So there are a lot of things to process. And I think for many people, you know, there have been studies even about sexuality. They looked into couples' sexual functioning, and they saw a decrease in people, you know, having intimate connection with their partners. And this was like on a large scale, you know, community kind of a study that they did in Israel. So it had a lot of impact on different aspects of life. So you know, the being able to feel close to your partner, or being able to, you know, in terms of your mood, or many aspects that are, and also, you know, the demand, because a lot of us have a lot of demands that are related to what's happening. And so I think there are more things that we need to handle these times. And it's, yeah, it is complex and difficult. And you know, I'm within the community of therapists, and I see how difficult it is for them. You know, to be having to juggle. You know, I'm thinking about, you know, within this clinic we have interns, and some of the interns, you know, they have to treat people who have gone through terrible things, and once while their husband, for example, is, you know, is in Gaza and is at risk, and they don't know, and they have the uncertainty of not knowing how is he doing and what's going on. So it's really, you know, if you think about it, it's really complex. And, you know, a lot of people who stayed, you know, a lot of family members, it could be wives or husbands, you know, the partner is, you know, in the war, and they're back home and they don't know. And in and of itself, it's a, you know, very, very stressful situation. So I think there are a lot of challenges that come with war. I would add to it that, you know, once it becomes a routine, it becomes a routine. I'm thinking about this morning, you know, we opened this morning with an alarm, a missile alarm from Yemen. And, you know, so I was in the middle of preparing my coffee, and my wife calls me to come, and wait a minute, I'll bring the coffee to the shelter. So, but it becomes a routine, you know, and that's, I would say that's the good thing about our ability to adapt to things.
Oh, Randy, you're on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. So a few people are asking about the process of cognitive behavior therapy for PTSD. And I want to just add in there, what are the effects of PTSD on the body, some of the physiological effects as well?
Well, first of all, I say, you know, the burden of PTSD is, you can think about it on different levels. Definitely the body is the one of the first place that you would see the burden. You know, and if you're talking, but I want to actually say something not about PTSD. I want to say something about war first. You know, a lot of the people that come back from the war, and not necessarily with PTSD, it takes time to recalibrate your body to, you know, being in a safe place. And people are much more hypervigilant. They respond, you know, a lot of time they respond with the startle response, or with anger, you know, they burst because they're very stressed, and it takes time to recalibrate the body to deal with the, you know, in a way, coming home. So this is something that we really have to train people to do. And actually the military started doing that. So they started actually helping people to train to getting back home. Now, if you think about PTSD, this recalibration doesn't happen. So the body stays really stressed all the time. And when the body stays stressed really all the time, you know, you can definitely see health concerns that can develop. And I think another part of it is that, you know, in the long run, definitely this is something that if it's not treated, you know, people with severe PTSD, we can even see the impact on their teeth because they're grinding their teeth when they're sleeping. And so you know, the body keeps the score in a way. You know, the body you know, takes it on, and this is something that we really, and I think this is one of actually the most challenging parts of treating PTSD within a war, especially such a long war. You know, this is like the longest war we had, and you know, people have been fighting for, you know, 300 days, and think about having your body in that stress for 300 days. You know, I really want to say it's something that it's very hard to imagine. And you know, I can say before I treated people within this war, I worked with people who have been in wars, and I worked with people who have been in traumatic events, but this is really very, very, very intense on the body. And you know, I can say that some of the stories we heard about the fighting, it's like, you know, very long fights, and you have to be hyper alert for, you know, hours, sometimes days. So this is really something that is challenging on the body and on getting back. There was another part to your question that I'm not sure that I answered.
Oh, some people had asked about the process of cognitive therapy for
Cognitive therapy.
PTSD.
Actually,
So,
then before you answer, I'll tighten the question a little bit. And this is a question, for example, from Dr. Beth, who lives here in Pennsylvania. She was actually a guest on another webinar that I hosted about a week ago or so. And she's doing a lot of work. And this is what she's saying. So thank you for Toda Rabba for your work. Dr. Beth's son is a lone soldier in Givati IDF. And about 1 out of 20 men in his unit were killed 3 weeks into, you know, serving Gaza, and he was able to participate in group therapy the next day to describe their experience as a preventative, you know, PTSD, and to take time off to attend the shivas. So this is kind of her back story, but she's asking if you can, you know, she's a professional, but maybe you can explain to laymen what's the difference of your treatment, like the very brief protocol for the soldiers for PTSD versus the traditional long-term PTSD treatment?
sure. First of all, I would say it's important to say you know, I train people to do cognitive processing therapy, but there are different therapies that work for PTSD, and it's important to say it. And the more treatments that we have that work, the better, and we can serve more people. And if one treatment doesn't work, maybe another one will. So this is an important thing to say. And in terms of cognitive processing therapy, we actually focus on what we call stuck points. And stuck points could be, I can give an example. For example, a soldier who, and we have really a lot of cases like this right now. Soldier who was in an event that some kind of a fight, they were ambushed, and he lost one of his friends. He tried to treat him, and the injury was too severe, and his best friend died. So the treatment would focus on cognitions that could block recovery. For example, it's my fault. You know, I should have saved him. He died because I froze. He didn't even necessarily froze. It took a minute to realize what happened and to realize what the injury is. And a lot of times people would get stuck on areas like this. So, you know, a lot of guilt, a lot of, you know, they would, for example, we saw somebody who blamed himself lying to his friend that he's going to leave while he was dying. And, you know, so, and you would target these areas of memory and work with the person to take a look at his thoughts. So if I say to myself, you know, it's my fault, you know, I lied to my friend when he was dying, I shouldn't have done this, I would feel guilty, and this will actually maintain my PTSD. And when we help, you know, soldiers to take a look at a lot of times to take a look at the level of training they had to assist the person who was injured, the level of training in first aid, for example, or when we would, for example, ask a person like this who said to his friend, "You're not going to die," what was the reason he told him he was not going to die? Okay, the reason was that he was trying to have him more relaxed. Okay, so we try to help soldiers, for example, look at the, motives that they had for their behaviors at the time of the event. And a lot of times in PTSD, what we see that people, have ideas of what they should have done, but that these options were not necessarily available at the time of the event. So that, or that they couldn't have known, or that it wasn't a possibility. So it's really looking at what happened and kind of sorting it out with the client. And we want to help them connect to, what we call the natural emotion. So for example, for the loss, we want the person to be able to connect to grief and sorrow about the loss of the friend. Or, if it was an event that he thought that he was going to die, we want him to be able to connect to the fear that he experienced at the time of the event. And usually when you connect with these emotions, what happens is very quickly they run their course, and when you don't have cognitions that are fueling them, like really negative cognitions, like it's my fault, I should have, usually, we start to see recovery. And the other part of it, another type of cognitions that we work within therapy, is a lot of overgeneralization. So a lot of people come back and they feel that the world is totally unsafe and it's totally dangerous, and I have to be hyper vigilant all the time, and I can't trust anyone. So these are the cognitions that we target within the therapy. And normally I can say targeting these cognitions and helping the person, have some distance from their thoughts, and also in a way question what they're saying to themselves. Usually very quickly, the recovery process initiates. So, and you don't need much more than that. We cognitive processing therapy even doesn't tell the person, to do too many things. We just tell people, avoidance is not a good thing. Avoidance is, if you want to recover, you have to stop the avoidance. But it's not necessarily. Some therapies, for example, prolonged exposure is another type of therapy. You have the person do and redo a lot of things. We just say, this is not good for your recovery, and let's look at the thoughts that are preventing you from doing what you used to do or getting back on track.
So Danny, just to clarify, it sounds like what you're describing as the first cognition that you're talking about, it's more of an enhanced thing that all of us experience. Maybe something at work or something with the kids, this sense that something happened, even if it's small, and you have in your head, should have, would have, could have. I should have done it and I would have, could have. But it's kind of easy to say now, when you're a quarterback, you're looking backwards at the event because now you're armed with the knowledge. But at the moment, you didn't really know, either it wasn't available or you just didn't know. But I mean, I do this all the time, even, simple things. I should have done this. So it sounds like it's a little bit like this, just much blown up to
on steroids.
On steroids.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's a saying that is attributed to Truman when asked about the atomic bomb, and he said, "No, I think," and he said, "Knowing now what I knew then, I would have made the same decision." And I think that this is the thing about trauma. A lot of times, when we are sitting comfortably on the couch and we're looking back, wonderful options. But at the time of the event, these options were not necessarily available, or you could have taken them and they would have ended up even worse. You don't know. And part of what we're trying to do is to show people that, so, for example, again, this is something that we see a lot now in the military. somebody would say, I could have saved him. Okay, and what happened? And the person would say, there's a lot of fire. And why didn't you go out and take him? Because I would have been dead if I went out. So what were you doing? And the person could say, well, I was trying to figure out a way to get to him without the fire hitting me. Okay, well, but a lot of times this information is not necessarily available to them when they're thinking about the event alone. So in a way, it's a kind of a guided discovery that we are doing with them, and looking at critical points in the event and questioning them about critical points in the event. And normally when people do that, so for example, if a person realizes that he did we want people to get to the place that they can see that they did their best within the situation. And, and a lot of times people ask me, but what if somebody was negligent? Okay, well, if somebody was negligent, I would say first, that's not most of the people we see. Most of the people we see did their best within a terrible situation. But even if people were negligent, and I think we can work with them first to take responsibility for, what they did, and then to accept that, their humanness and that people make mistakes. And sometimes mistakes have terrible consequences, but that doesn't mean that you're a bad person or, that you deserve, never to be happy, or a lot of times these are the things that we see that people say to themselves after traumatic event.
Randy, you're on mute.
I just want to add that Noga Kessler in the Q&A wrote the importance of altering the narrative of the story to allow for forgiveness, and I just lost the other part, to allow for forgiveness and healing. It sort of dovetails with what you were saying.
Yeah, I agree with this completely. We want to foster compassion towards self and towards others. By the way, we also see a lot of soldiers who blame their commanders for things. And again, we want them to be able to have compassion also for the mistakes that other people did.
Right. We've had a couple of questions regarding the role of families in treatment for PTSD. Are families pulled into therapy? Are they given tools? What's their role in all of this?
I would say within this treatment manual specifically, family is not a part of the treatment, but I would say, in our clinic, when we work with people, a lot of times we have the family involved, and involved in different ways. We can have the family involved in a way that they only get, information, psychoeducation about PTSD, but we can also, have them in and in a way, see how they can be part of healing and not part of the avoidance cycle. And I can say a lot of time families, they really, really want the best for the person who is dealing with PTSD, but by doing so, they actually accommodate for avoidance. And that is something that we don't want. And, and then we usually have them for like sometimes session or two to guide them how to deal with it. And of course, with the agreement of the client. So this is something that I personally like it when the client advises them, and comes to terms with the idea that this is something that could be good for my healing process.
Danny, there's a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm going to combine them to one. So first from Veronica, who I believe is a psychiatrist who's planning on making Aliyah. And what she's saying is that she is interested in her profession in the role of psychedelic medications and helping people recover from PTSD. And, the research that is going on in Israel with the psychedelic medicine, and that she is hoping to start a project using Ibogaine I'm not familiar with this medication, and PTSD and traumatic brain injury. And she's just interested in what you know about this, if maybe you're interested in collaboration. But, and there's another question of Naama, who's a big activist in the Pennsylvania area, who will add to this question. What is your opinion about NDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD? Is it used in Israel? And Naama actually just came back from Israel a couple of days after a long visit.
So I would say I'm a conservative when it comes to treatments. And I would say I'm not a conservative, meaning that don't test it and let's see the data. And I think that for many years, what we saw is, fear of researching these agents or these materials. And I think that in recent years, there's a growing interest in these medications and how to use them. And the last ISTSS meeting in Boston was in October or September. And I think that was the biggest and hottest thing. So, MD research and other materials that are being tested. And I think it's great because if initially it was something that was done in the dark, now everybody wants to study it. And in Israel, there are actually several studies who are running. And what I liked about the way it was presented in ISTSS was the question is now not should we use it? The question is how to use it and with what treatments and what combinations. And I think in a few years we will have great data on it that will come also from Israel because there are studies that are running now. And, if you look at the data on PTSD, conventional medications have failed. There are no medications for PTSD. So definitely we need to find new agents and new possibilities for PTSD. But also there's a risk because I can say, for example, with cannabis that is often used with PTSD, I think that the benefits are much smaller than what is presented, and a lot of times they interfere with recovery. So I think again, and I'm not sure that the same results are going to be for other materials and agents that are being tested. And I think the data is important and good research is important. And if you're coming to Israel, let's talk and see what we can do.
I sent Veronica your email and she can connect. There's a lot of excellent questions in the chat. We are going to try to get through a lot of them. Just as a reminder, we're going to stop for Danny, respective Danny's time and everybody's time, 15 minutes after the hour. So we still have about 25 minutes to go. Really fascinating questions. I'll take the next question of Nina. And I think it's really interesting because I think about it often. It's not only about the war with the horrible kidnapped and the murder and all of that. There's a big component of a psychological war, Danny, that it's all the exposure to social media, the horrible, scary, terrifying movies that the Hamas are releasing of the, all this or when they release them with all the, it's so scary, the psychological war. So Nina's question is, how will Israel treat all this psychological war via social media created by our enemy? Do you feel that, or do you see in your profession that this takes an impact on anxiety related disorders, what we see on the social media and the psychological warfare?
I think that the initial, videos that people were exposed to, I think we saw a lot of people that were impacted by these videos. I think more than now with the psychological war that is being, used or done with the hostages. But I think initially we saw a lot of people that were exposed to the terrible videos of the killings and torturing of people, and that really it impacted them, and they had severe symptoms of anxiety and of some people had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorders and also depression. So, and a lot of people don't consume these videos. I think that they are released. First of all, they check with the families if they're allowed to the videos to be released, and otherwise they don't release them to the larger media. And I can say even in Telegram groups, like news group, they ask not to release the videos before the families approve of it. So really, you really have to want to get the videos if you get them before that. And I think that once it's within the public sphere, I think a lot of times it is processed. The fact that the family, and the videos are terrible, but I think it's easier to metabolize them when it's a shared experience that we have.
Collective experience. Randy?
Yeah, a few people have asked whether you have worked with any of the returned hostages or survivors of Nova. I know that we heard a couple of cases of suicide amongst some of the people, and of course that got our attention. Just wondered what the experiences that you have had perhaps with some of these.
So we did have, and I did have experience with people from the Nova, and mostly the experience that we have now is military. And the people who are returning, personally, I did not have experience with, but some of my colleagues did. And definitely these are more complex traumatic events because of the length of the time that they were away and the tortures that they went through. But I would say, I would say that, and I would say it cautiously, but I think, with good treatment, they will recover, and people recover also from these terrible experiences of being hostages. And there are a lot of good minds working on that, and I can say that knowing some of the people who have treated people who return, the level of commitment that they have for that is really exceptional. So I'm hopeful that they'll recover as well.
Daniel, let me ask you a question about, that most of the people on this call or who will watch this recording are, we don't have the background of, therapy. And what do you think happens? Let's say that there is you treat or you see people who are in the military and were injured, or they saw horrible things like we've discussed before. You say that your type of treatment, which is, a few weeks perhaps, is extremely effective and you can cure it. But what happens if, how would you compare it to the natural history of the condition, meaning that they come and they get absolutely nothing, that they have to, heal on their own, they have to deal with everything on their own and just perseverate and keep thinking about it? What is the damage, long-term for years throughout all their life if we don't, take care of this problem acutely?
It's a complex question, but I'll try to answer it. I think that people can recover even if they get treatment 30 years and 40 years after trauma. And some of the studies looked at Vietnam vets or Korea vets in the US. And these are people who had traumas that were 30 years old or 40 years, and they were able to be treated and recover, not as good as if you treat it earlier, but still there's a path to recovery. And I can say I come from half of my heritage is German, and many of our family were killed in Auschwitz and some survived it. And I can say they came back and they built a country, and they did a good job with building a country. And I think, this is again, I think, some of them did not recover because there were no treatments. And some don't recover even with treatments. But I think these are very few. If you think about, how many people don't recover. So, about 70% of us will go through a traumatic event that is what we call criterion A of the DSM. So it's a traumatic event that is traumatic enough to have like PTSD. And when you look at the data is that the less than 13% will have PTSD across their lifetime. And if you look at a certain point in time, it's even less. So if you and the majority of people would recover. And we have to keep that in mind. Of course, there are those who don't recover. But, and even for them, I think a lot of times, I can say from my experience, before October 7th, and I worked with PTSD since 2000. And a lot of time people would come to me and say, "You're my last hope." And what I would tell people, wait a minute, let's see what you did if you're saying I'm your last hope, because there are a lot of treatments for PTSD. And usually when you look with people what they did, what they got for therapy, they received psychotherapy. And psychotherapy is not going to treat your PTSD. There are several treatments that will treat your PTSD. And if you haven't received these treatments, you haven't been treated. And I can say the majority of people that I saw, even if they did one treatment for PTSD, they had at least 2 or more 3 treatments that were available that they could try. And today we have a lot of other treatments that are developing. So for example, for the hyperarousal symptoms that we see in PTSD, Arik Shalev and his colleagues developed some kind of a neurofeedback treatment, and this is a treatment that helps with with the arousal symptoms. So there are more treatments who are developing, and the MD assisted therapy is another. I can say one of my clients in Israel, she actually tried different treatments for PTSD, and at the end of the day, she improved with every one of them. But at the end of the MD assisted one was the one that made the big difference. So we have options. And, if you have a client that is saying, I tried it all, let's see.
I'm wondering about the children, the effects on PTSD on kids, kids that have been exposed to numerous alarms. We were talking about it becomes the norm, but think about the kids in Sderot, for instance, who have been exposed to so many alarms. What's your experience with children? Are they as resilient as we think they are?
It's an interesting question. I don't work with children, but I talk about it a lot with people around me. And of course that, some children, it's very difficult for them. I can say discussing it with my own children, they talk about, for example, the alarms are difficult, especially when they wake you up in the middle of the night. And, some people live closer to the border, so they have many of those. And, and I think I would say, children are as resilient as adults. They might have different needs, but the tendency for recovery is there. But I do think there are programs that actually help children, and programs within schools. There's a wonderful project that Professor Dani Chamiel developed in schools, and they actually had it was funny, I'm not sure is the right word to say, but it was kind of funny. It was in a project that was in Sderot, and they did half of the schools, and then they had a war. So they did half of the schools, and half of the school received the intervention, and by chance the other half didn't get the intervention. So they were able to see, with the same principles of cognitive therapy, they were able to build resilience. So there are ways to do that, and
Danny, there's a lot of comments who are like really incredibly supportive, different people who are through different organizations supporting the mental well-being in Israel. But I wanted to read one comment of David Price. He writes, we have started what we believe is the first of its kind PTSD peer support groups for IDF veterans living outside of Israel. The program is founded by the Federation, the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, in conjunction with Beit Elochem. We're looking to train more volunteers and expand the programming. Do you know of other groups doing the same job? So I connected, I gave him your email address, but, because there's so many of these comments, I wanted to know, do you have all this amazing work that you're doing with so many volunteers that you're training to take care of? Avodah shelcha ze avodat kodesh. It's holy work what you're doing. Is there an organization, if anybody on this call or in the future will watch this, that we can somehow help you, support you in any way, financial or others? Is there a website that you have?
We've been, our project initially was initiated by the Gavin Farrell Foundation in the US. Leah Paskin is the person who actually initiated the trauma project in Israel. So this is one, and they're continually supporting us and the project of training therapists to treat PTSD. People can connect me, and I can say one of the things that I'm doing now is I'm actually trying to work with different organizations that are giving other services, not therapy, and to have them. So in our last training, I had two people from one organization who is Chava, farm. Yeah, it's like a therapeutic farm, and we are training them so they have idea about therapeutic principles. And one of the things I think that there should be done, there are a lot of services now that are available in Israel, and there's too little collaboration between the different organizations. And that's the challenge that I think that we should foster. Because, for example, if this farm is able to detect those who need therapy and refer them, and is able to work with the principles of recovery, we have a better chance of having people recover. And this is true for a therapeutic farm, but it's also true for journeys that they do with soldiers, or it's true for other organizations who give different services. And there are a lot of wonderful things, but I think that we should train these organizations to have a therapeutic mind in terms of, and also to identify those in need. And I can say one of the therapists that works within our project is also working in another project of journeys. And she said, I saw two soldiers who were in the same event. One received therapy that was within our project, and another one received like a general psychotherapy. And she said it was amazing to see how one of them recovered and the other one is still stuck. So, and I think this is the take-home message. There are treatments available. There are services within the public system. There are services, we are working now on actually having services available so people can get the treatment itself, not only through the HMOs, but also through other options. Because a lot of people contacted us, that they tried through the public system and they couldn't, or for some reason it failed. Fine. So we would, and we would do the connecting to the therapist and make sure that the therapists are supervised. So as I said, one option is turning, to the Gavin Farrell Foundation, who's actually doing this wonderful work in Israel and in other places in the world. And also other options is to contact me directly, and I'd be happy to make connections and see if, and if people want to donate, we can check on which, direction would be.
And I'm going to share in the chat, Danny, both your website, the drderby.com, and also I just shared the Gavin Farrell Foundation information if anybody wants to read and learn more. Randy, next question. Unmute yourself. No, you have to unmute.
Yeah. Can you differentiate between PTSD and complex PTSD? We've had a couple of people ask.
Sure. normally when we talk, and actually this treatment that I'm talking about, cognitive processing therapy, was studied both on PTSD and complex PTSD, and it works well for both. Complex PTSD, normally when we talk about it, so people who returned from captivity could have complex PTSD. And when we think about complex PTSD, it's first of all, it's PTSD. So you have to have the symptoms of PTSD, because a lot of times people are, wrong about it, and they think that it's sometimes some kind of childhood trauma and not necessarily, related to the symptoms of PTSD. So the PTSD is one important part of it. So you have to have the intrusive symptoms, for example, of PTSD. These could be nightmares or flashbacks or some kind of intrusive memories. The other components that we see in complex PTSD is actually the emotional regulation component is much more severe, and also interpersonal relationships that are more troubled for people with complex PTSD. And this is something, that can be addressed within this treatment. I can say that my actually first CPT treatment was when I was in the US, and it was a woman that was, she had severe abuse from both her parents. And when you think about the amounts of traumatic events that she had like all her childhood, she had traumatic events. But still, you would work with the most, when you work with PTSD and complex PTSD, you would work with the most severe event. So you take the hardest event that they had within these, traumatic events that they had throughout their childhood, and you work with this event.
One more question that we have, and we have about 7 more minutes, and then, out of respect of your time, we'll let you go. But there's a lot of really fascinating questions. One more question is, from your experience, have you noticed a difference in terms of treatment of religious versus non-religious or secular Jews in Israel? Or, does religion even partake in the therapy somehow from your experience?
Actually, a colleague of mine, Professor Sarah Friedman from Bar-Ilan University, we used to work together at Hadassah University Hospital. So one of her papers actually looked at people who were religious and were in a traumatic event. And I would say, it could be for some people protective, and for others, it could be something that get them stuck, and they get their beliefs become, in a way, trauma can break your belief, even if it's not religious. So we say, we have certain beliefs about the world, about others, and also we have beliefs about God. And a traumatic event could have this belief, break. And when we say break, so for example, I must have done something really wrong for this to happen to me. So that's one thing that we can see. And another thing that we can see is anger towards God. Why did God do this to me? Or maybe there's no God. And I think we saw in Israel, we saw a lot of I think that this is both to religious and non-religious people. I think that we had our belief system really was challenged. Our beliefs about our ability to live in peace with our neighbors, our beliefs about, and I'm not saying we can't, I'm saying it was challenged. So it's really, I think this October 7th really challenged us in many ways and terms.
Danny, one more very practical question again from Naama, who just came back from about a month in Israel. How hard it is or easy it is for a person to reach out to you to get your support? Because what she says is that she hears after her visit there that the psychological support in Israel, maybe because they're so overburdened, is very hard to get to, and it takes a very long time to get to.
So currently we are actually, this is one of the helps that we get from the Gavin Farrell Foundation. Right now what we're trying to do is that we will have funding to for people to get the therapy so they can contact directly our list of therapists, some of them who've been trained within the project, but all who've been trained within this cognitive processing therapy, and so that they be able to get treatment under supervision. For me, that's the important part, the quality of the services that they get. And this is something that, so people can reach out, and, when they reach out, hopefully soon, really soon, we'll be able to, provide the service with, some kind of a sliding scale, that they, can pay a very small amount for the treatment, and the rest of it is paid into donation.
Randy, do you want to take the next question? There's several more questions that I'm happy to ask. Maybe you'll prepare your next question, but I think that there's an interesting question by Carol. Is your experience in terms of PTSD treatment, does it make a big difference if you do it in person, like I'm coming to your office, versus you do it like we're now in front of the screen and on a Zoom type of video therapy?
Actually, I would say there's a saying that I like, now, nice story, now show me the data. So I can say a nice story, and I can show the data. You can be treated via Zoom. It's not a problem. People, telehealth studies on CPT and other treatments are available, and these are effective treatments, and you can do it online. And I can say, I personally don't like working online, but it's very effective. I don't like the experience of not having the person in my room, but a lot of times you have the materials open on the computer, both of you are having the materials in front of you, and you just do the work, and it's the therapy can have a very good flow. And so telehealth works well.
Danny, earlier you mentioned completed grief, and I wrote it down with a question mark. Yeah. Oh, complicated grief. Oh, okay. Sorry, completed grief. Can you explain that?
One of the things that we, complicated grief is actually when somebody lost somebody close to them, and it's over a year. So a year passed. I can say that, many of the people we see, they don't necessarily have the year, time passed, but we see a lot of soldiers who are dealing with traumatic loss, and traumatic loss increases the risk of complicated grief. And a lot of the symptoms are somewhat similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, especially if the event is something that they were in and they saw it, and they saw their friend that died. And the difference we can say is that people experience yearning for the person who died, and sadness, and so these are, and the thing is, it doesn't go away. It stays, and it stays very intensive. And there's also a lot of avoidance around the death-related issues and the lost person. So, for example, let's say that I, used to spend time with you, and we used to go on to a restaurant every week. So now I avoid restaurants, because restaurants are a reminder that you died. And we used to go hiking, and now I avoid hiking, because hiking becomes associated with your memory. So we see a lot of people who have that, and and even though some of them don't meet the criteria yet because the year criterion haven't passed, still it's, we can encourage them and intervene and actually help them recover also from the grief component of it. And loss and grief, if you think about it, it's something natural and normal. It's normal and natural to feel sadness when you lose someone, but I think it can get complicated when you start avoiding, and you have beliefs such that I cannot live my life without him, and I do not deserve to live without him. And these are the things we target in therapy.
Danny, we're at time. And first of all, I wanted to say that, this is unbelievably, the feedback already from people is that it's been so, fascinating and interesting. And, it's just so good to know that there are options for anybody in Israel, soldiers who are suffering this, but generally people who are suffering PTSD from horrible events that they went through. We have options of treatment nowadays, amazing options. And it's good to know that there's these resources available. I wanted to thank Randy and Ivy and Naamat in general for creating this beautiful, amazing event. And Danny, I wanted to thank you for everything that you're doing. Again, I'm hearing so much from my sister about you, but we all know about the impact that you're making in Israel and the lives of so many people, and especially our brave soldiers who are going to, fight for the safety of all the Israelis and the Jews. So really thank you for everything that you're doing. It's unbelievable. And again, the links to the website, if somebody didn't catch it, it's dr-derby.com. And that's the best way to get in touch and learn more about what Danny is doing. So with that, toda rabba, everybody. And thank you, Randy. Thank you, Ivy.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you all. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Go eat dinner now. Go eat dinner now.
Yeah.
Okay. Be well.
Toda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yair and Ivy.
Thank you. Bye.